The room smelled like nothing. That was the first thing I noticed. Every institution I had ever worked in carried a smell. Antiseptic on the clinical wings, floor wax in the long corridors. That particular staleness of recycled air that works itself into your clothes after a 12-hour shift and rides home with you on the bus. The Corvith Institute's exam hall had none of it. The air was temperature perfect and odorless, which is harder to achieve than it sounds, and the absence created a disorientation I couldn't place for the first few minutes of sitting there. It felt, eventually, like the smell of a place that had never held a dying person. In 39 years of breathing, I had never once been in a place like that. I hadn't realized such places existed. I found my station by the number on the wall, a pale column of bioluminescent script that pulsed once, briefly, when my hand passed near it, the way a living thing flinches from an unfamiliar shadow. Around me, the other candidates were settling into their own positions, 14 of us in total. 13 Corvith Institute students, graduate track, 2 years into the Continuant Sciences program, which was the formal name for what the Institute taught to the people it intended to train as end of life practitioners for species across 6 settled systems. And me, my name is Dorian Vass. I am from Galway on the western coast of Ace Island, on the planet Earth. I am 39 years old. I have been a palliative care nurse for 17 of those years, which means I have spent 17 years in rooms where people are dying. And my job in those rooms is to ensure that the process is as supported, as dignified, and as painless as the available tools and knowledge can make it. I should not have been in that exam hall. The admission was an error. I had tried to correct it. The admissions coordinator at the Corvith Institute was a Velthris, a species that communicates with the upper half of their body language through the angle and movement of a secondary head crest that sits just above their brow line. She had reviewed my 17 years of professional records, and the crest had gone utterly still, which I later learned meant something in Velthris body language that translated approximately as processing significant data. She had looked at the records for a long time. Your documented case file, she said finally, includes records from 4,312 patient engagement periods. Patient encounters, I said. Yes, something like that. Of these, 2,118 conclude with what our system classifies as termination events. Deaths, I said. They ended in deaths. That's what termination events are. The crest tilted 5 degrees to the left, which I'd since learned was what Velthris do when they want to be technically precise about something. Of the 2,118 terminal conclusions, 1,906 were attended, meaning you were physically present and responsible for the care environment at the time of cessation. Yes, I said. Our most experienced practitioner graduates have approximately 300. Attended termination events at the time of their first independent licensure, she said. Our most experienced senior faculty have between 600 and 800 across full careers. I looked at her. So there's been a filing error. On the contrary, she said, your record places you in a classification category that our system has no existing. File 4. The system flagged you for admission to the Advanced Practitioner track because it identified the highest concentration of terminal attendance events it has ever processed from a non-institutional applicant. The algorithm that makes admission recommendations does not appear to have the capacity to recognize that your record constitutes an error. Identified it as qualification. I'm a nurse, I said, not a continuance scientist. I don't have the theoretical framework a lower your program is built on. Your students do 2 years of coursework before they sit their qualifying assessment. I haven't done 2 hours. No, she agreed. That is unusual. It's a mistake. The crest did a slow oscillation I didn't have a reading for yet. Our review board has considered the file. The decision was to retain the admission. I sat there for a moment. Why? I asked. Because, she said. The review board's position is that the error, if it is one, will become apparent at the null resonance assessment. And if it is not an error, the review board considers it important to understand what they are dealing with. Was How I came to be sitting in desk 14 of the Corvus Institute's assessment hall on a planet whose name translated into something like the place of measured consideration, which I privately thought was the most alien thing about the whole world, that someone had named it like a policy memorandum, waiting for an examination I had done nothing to prepare for. The proctor entered through a door I hadn't seen because it was flush with the wall. He was a Gelthari, tall 2.5 meters roughly, moving in the unhurried way of a species whose skeletal priorities are organized differently from mine. Not wrong, just arranged around different assumptions about what a body needs to do. His speaking apparatus was in his chest cavity, gave his voice a resonance you felt in your sternum rather than heard in your ears, and his eyes were positioned on the sides of his head such that facing you directly meant looking at two different things simultaneously, which required some getting used to. He stood at the front of the room without introducing himself. The null resonance assessment, he said, proceeds in 7 tiers. Each tier is a precisely calibrated exposure sequence designed to elevate psychological stress indices through confrontation with mortality constructs. You will experience simulated presentations of terminal decline, existential severance, irreversible biological cessation, and associated phenomenological data. Your biometric response at each tier is recorded continuously. Any point you may signal discontinuation by pressing the amber contact on your desk surface. Discontinuation is not failure, it is data. If your stress indices exceed threshold parameters before you signal discontinuation, the system will discontinue on your behalf. He paused and held the room for a moment. His eyes, one on each side, observed 2 separate portions of the space with a quality I can only describe as professional gravity. No candidate in the history of this program has completed Tier 7, he said. He said it as a statement of record, not as a warning, not as a challenge, the way you'd read a gauge. Tier 7 has not been completed in 41 assessment cycles. The record is Tier 6, Section 3. That candidate required restorative care for 11 days following this assessment. One more pause. One more slow survey of the room. You may begin. The desk surface activated. A smooth curved screen materialized in the air above it, tilted toward me at approximately 30 degrees, the angle of a document you're meant to read without picking up. The interface was clean, no text at first, just a soft neutral field that waited. Tier 1 was a data presentation, a patient's biological parameters in systemic decline, a species I hadn't encountered before, but the reading sounds translated through the Institute's standard notation, and the patterns were older to me than my career. Organ function indices trending downward in overlapping waves, each system slowing on its own schedule, sequences beginning to pull apart from each other in the way they do when coordination between systems starts to fail. Fluid accumulation curves with the specific bend that means the body is retaining what it can no longer process. And the respiratory trace, that particular plateau then drop signature that I had watched on monitors more times than I had catalogued, in rooms on 3 wards in 2 hospitals. The shape your eyes learn to recognize the way a sailor learns to read the sky. I read through it methodically. The tonal system added an auditory component, not recordings of the patient, but a rendered interpretation, a descending chord sequence that was probably calibrated to land somewhere specific in the emotional architecture of a Corvus cadet who had spent 2 years being trained to feel the weight of what those readings mean. The tonal rendering was well made. Whoever had built it had understood that the right way to make someone feel the significance of data is to translate it into a register the nervous system responds to before the thinking mind does. I looked at the respiratory trace and thought, they have 6 hours at the current trajectory, maybe slightly less if the secondary fluid accumulation doesn't slow. The proximate cause is going to be respiratory compromise from the pleural involvement, not the primary systemic failure. The heart will still be technically working when breathing becomes impossible. If you were treating them, you'd be looking at whether a drain is viable, but at this point in the progression you'd be draining for comfort, not for outcome. The difference matters. You have to know which thing you're doing before you do it, or you end up performing an intervention for your own need to do something rather than for the patient's need to be eased. I noted that distinction. Then I moved to the next screen. I was aware, at the periphery of my attention, that the cadet to my left had gone very still. Not the stillness of concentration. The deeper stillness of someone whose breathing has slowed because something has reached them. Their biometric readout would be climbing. I didn't look at it, it wasn't my business. But I could map the trajectory from 17 years of being rooms where biometrics were climbing and learning to read the room rather than the monitor. They weren't weak. None of the cadets in that room were weak. They had done 2 years of preparation specifically designed to build toward this moment, and that preparation was real and serious, and had clearly worked on all of them in ways that mattered. But I had been doing the actual thing in real rooms with real patients and real families since I was 22 years old on a hospital ward in Connacht, and the thing that takes the breath from you the first 100 times eventually becomes the medium you work in. Not because the weight goes away, because you learn to carry it while also doing everything else the work requires. Tier 1 ended, I advanced. Tier 2 added an interactive component. A decision matrix, a patient with competing presenting conditions, a treatment history branching across several defensible paths, and a current status that could be addressed by one of several approaches, each with different endpoint probabilities. The task was navigation. Choose the path, follow the consequences, choose again. The scenarios where I selected paths that led to deterioration, and there were 2, because the matrix had been built, so that the correct path required passing through a choice that appeared favorable and wasn't, showed me the deterioration. The tonal system shifted. The data curves bent in the direction that means a system has stopped contributing to the patient's coherence, and then bent further in the direction that means several systems have stopped, and then the cascade that means the body has arrived at its final accounting. I worked through the matrix without rushing. I had time, and rushing a decision matrix, because you're uncomfortable with where it's pointing, is how you make bad decisions. The answer I arrived at, the palliative care path, rather than the aggressive intervention path, was not the one the Matrix appeared designed to reward. The Matrix had been built, I suspected, around the assumption that a practitioner would choose to fight. That was what 2 years of Corveth training would produce. People with a framework built on the idea that death was a problem to be opposed, and that the measure of good practice was the vigor of the opposition. I understood that framework. I had worked alongside it for most of my career. And I understood why the Matrix's designers had built the aggressive intervention path into the system as the expected choice, because the people they were training would bring that instinct to the decision. The secondary organ involvement and the age-equivalent markers, and the specific way the patient's history read across the intake documentation suggested someone who had made a private accounting of what they were willing to endure, and the aggressive intervention path read like a decisions that would override that accounting in favor of the practitioner's discomfort with the alternative. I chose the palliative path. I annotated why in enough detail that the reasoning would be visible to anyone reviewing the documentation after the fact. The annotation process matters. A decision without a record of its reasoning is just a decision. A decision with its reasoning documented is something that can be examined, questioned, and either validated or corrected. One of the most important things a practitioner can do in a contested or ambiguous case is make the inside of their thinking available, because the inside of their thinking is the thing most likely to contain the error they haven't spotted yet. You make it visible so that the other people in the room can help you see it. The system accepted my navigation. The matrix completed. The cadet to my left signaled discontinuation midway through Tier 2. I noted it without looking up from the screen. Tier 3 was what the assessment documentation called a full environmental immersion sequence. The desk surface darkened. The lighting in the assessment hall changed. I felt it before I saw it. The shift in the ambient light spectrum toward a quality I recognized immediately because I had sat under it on shift after shift for 17 years. Particular artificial warmth of a care facility's patient room light, engineered to be comfortable and landing consistently a degree or two short of actually comfortable, which may be intentional or may be a technical limitation that no one has resolved because the rooms have other priorities. The air handling system made a shift I felt rather than heard, and the screens came back, all of them simultaneously, showing me not a data display but a room, a care room, rendered with enough fidelity that I could see the texture of the wall panels, the specific way monitoring leads, gather and sag between anchor points, the floor with its anti-slip surface, and the chair positioned at the angle of the chair that has been sat in often and repositioned slightly each time and has arrived at a compromise between optimal and habitual. The patient in the bed was a Pelthani. Grey-skinned, large-eyed, the secondary spinal structure that gives them a characteristic forward posture, upright, lying flat, secondary spines flush with the mattress, eyes closed. The biometrics were on the wall above the bed. I read them. A voice said, "The patient has declined further intervention. They have requested presence." In the Corvus framework, I had read enough of the curriculum documentation to know that requesting presence meant the last protocol, the one where clinical intervention was over and the work became something else. You stayed with the patient not because staying accomplished any medical outcome, but because the Gelthari medical ethics tradition, which had formed the backbone of the Corveth curriculum, held that dying without witness was a specific category of harm, that a person passing from existence without another consciousness attending them experienced something that diminished the completeness of their ending, whether that was literally measurable or a framework of comfort that cultures build because they need it. I wasn't equipped to evaluate from the outside. What I understood immediately was what the simulation wanted from me. Stay in the room. Be present. Hold steady through what was coming. I pulled the chair closer to the bed. In 17 years in 2 hospitals, across 4 wards and more transferred patients than I kept count of after the first 5 years, I had done this more times than the Corvus Institute had run assessment cycles since its founding. I knew what the biometrics above the bed would do in the next 20 minutes if the trajectory held. I knew the specific change in breathing rate and depth that precedes the final stage by somewhere between minutes and hours, and the way the room adjusts to it. The particular silence that a room develops, not absence of sound but a different quality of sound, the sounds of machines and distant corridors, unchanged but somehow muted, as if the room itself is paying attention. I knew the 30-second window when clinical assessment is irrelevant and everything is either still happening or has stopped. And I knew the period after that, and what the period after that asks of the person in the chair, and what it costs to give what it asks, and I knew how to give it anyway. The Tier 3 simulation ran its full sequence. I will not say it was easy. I want to be careful about that, because accuracy matters more here than presentation. I was not unmoved. You do not become unmoved. Thing people who have done this work for a long time learn is not how to stop being moved, but how to be moved and remain. How to let the weight land without letting the weight knock you out of the room, because the room still needs you and your feelings about being in the room are not the room's concern. It is a skill that has a name in no language I know, but that is recognizable on sight in any practitioner who has it. The steadiness that coexists with feeling rather than replacing it. When the sequence ended and the screens returned to neutral, I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk surface. Then I advanced to Tier 4. 3 more cadets had discontinued. I counted the empty stations without looking at them directly. 7 of us remained, including me. The proctor was standing near the back of the room. I had been aware of him in the way I stay aware of a room's edges, even when I'm focused on its center, as background information that I'm not attending to, but that I'd notice if it changed. His posture had shifted from the professional stillness he'd held at the assessment's opening. He was watching me in particular. Not monitoring, watching. The kind of attention you pay when you're not sure what you're looking at. I'd been watched that way before, not often. The last time was during a clinical review 3 years ago by a consulting physician from Edinburgh who had come through St Brendan's evaluating palliative protocols, and he had sat in on 2 of my patient rounds without saying much, and afterward had asked me to explain my decision-making process in one specific room, and I had explained it, and he had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Been doing this long enough to have made a framework you didn't know you were making." I'd taken that as a compliment. I believe it was meant as one. Tier 4 was what the documentation would later describe as accelerated serial exposure. Multiple patient scenarios arriving in rapid sequence, each terminal, each with full biometric data and environmental rendering and tonal accompaniment. The research behind the assessment had found that candidates who achieved stability through Tier 3, who had held through the presence protocol, often encountered cumulative failure at Tier 4, that the sequential weight of 3, 4, 5 close interval terminal scenarios created a psychological debt that the previous tiers had not anticipated, and that the debt eventually came due regardless of how well prepared the candidate was. The first scenario, a young patient, age equivalent markers placing them in late adolescence for their species. A genetic condition identified at enrollment in what the records showed as a standard pre-admission health screening, identified then, tracked across the treatment history, the period of stability noted with the particular careful language that clinical records use for periods of stability, because the clinician knows the stability is conditional, and then the current presentation, which the records had been building toward for the length of the patient's documented file. Whoever built these scenarios understood that the right detail is not the most dramatic one. The most dramatic moment in a case is not the hardest one to carry. The hardest one is the moment where the records show a period of stability and know what followed it. The second scenario, a patient with no records trail, admitted without identification, no family contact established, no personal history recoverable from the standard intake processes. The simulation presented this as a data entry issue, an intake problem, gap in the file, the clean language of a record system encountering something it has no field for. The weight of it was not in the language but in the subtext of the blank fields, which is the subtext of someone who arrived at the end of their life without the context that the people around them were supposed to hold. I had had patients like that, not many, but enough to know that the work in those rooms is the same work as in every other room, and that absence of documentation does not mean absence of the person, and that staying present for a person you cannot know is not a lesser form of presence. The third scenario, an error case. A treatment decision made earlier in the simulation's constructed history had led through a chain of compounding complications that each seemed manageable at the time they occurred to the current terminal status. Not a large error, not a dramatic one. A choice between 2 defensible options, both within the standard of care, where the less chosen option had turned out to be the less favorable one, and the consequences of that choice had moved through the patient's physiology quietly over an extended period and were now paying out in full. The scenario made certain you could trace the line. It did not make it easier to trace. The fourth scenario was the hardest. A patient with a complete file, full records trail, family contact well established and present throughout the documented history. An attentive care team reflected in the documentation, thorough notes, appropriate escalations, evidence of coordination and communication. Patient had been supported, informed, surrounded. Every element of a well-held end-of-life process had been present and functioning. The tonal rendering for this scenario was quieter than the others. Fewer notes, more space between them, and the thing still ended. The same finality as every other thing, because that is the logic of it, which does not change based on how well prepared anyone in the room is, and which is not something that can be fixed or corrected or improved upon because it is not a problem. It is a destination that all roads lead to on different schedules. The most prepared ending is not a different ending. It is the same one, better witnessed. After the fourth scenario, Tier 4 ended. I became aware that the room had lost more of its population. I looked up. 3 of us remained. The cadet to my right was still at her station. She was a Galthari student, the one I'd identified early on as the strongest in the room, partly from the way she had moved me to her station with the particular economy of motion that comes from having trained intensively for something, partly from the quality of her stillness through tiers 1 and 2, which was the stillness of someone running a controlled internal process, not the stillness of someone shutting down. She was still running that process. I could see the cost of it in her posture, which had changed since Tier 2 in the specific direction of someone who is spending reserves they were hoping to keep. The third remaining candidate was further down the row, a Palthani male who had been moving through the tiers with a careful or deliberate pace. I respected the pace. Careful and deliberate is the right approach. It doesn't protect you, but it is the right approach. Proctor had moved closer to the middle of the room. He was watching all 3 of us. His attention had changed quality again. There was something in it now that I recognized from clinical consultations, where the senior practitioner realizes they've encountered a case that is going to teach them something. I advanced to Tier 5. Tier 5 departed from the pattern. The previous tiers had positioned me as observer, as decision maker, as witness attending someone else's process. Tier 5 put me inside the scenario in a different way. The desk surface darkened completely. The assessment hall's environmental systems engaged in a configuration that was qualitatively different from Tier 3. Tier 3 had shifted the room toward a clinical care environment and left the room's basic reality intact. Tier 5 did something more complete. The edges of the hall became uncertain. Not absent. I knew I was sitting at a desk in an assessment hall on a planet that wasn't mine. But the edges pulled back. Came into focus was a room that I did not need any acclimatization period to recognize. It was a patient room, not the Palthani patient room from Tier 3, a different one, smaller, the different quality of furniture, the kind that accumulates in care facilities over long years of service, chairs that have been sat in thousands of times and repaired twice, the specific worn quality of a surface that has been important to people repeatedly and carries that importance in its texture. 1 chair, 1 monitoring station, 1 bed. The patient in the bed was rendered as human. I held that for a moment. The patient was an older man. The age markers placed him in his late 60s or early 70s. He was on his back. His eyes were open, and he was looking at the ceiling in the particular unfocused way of someone who is no longer fully tracking the visual data in front of them, who is attending to something interior or nothing at all. The biometrics on the wall above him said what they said. I read them and set them aside because the room was saying the same thing more directly. The simulation's voice said, "He is asking for someone to stay." I sat down in the chair. Tier 5 is the part of this account that I am least able to render in useful detail. I can say is that it ran long. What I can say is that the designers of Tier 5 had built it around a different understanding of what this work looks like than the previous tiers had. Tiers 1 through 4 were about the weight of the work, the accumulation of it, the way the thing you're doing presses on you. Tier 5 was about something quieter than weight. The specific quality of presence that a room like that requires, and the specific quality of time that passes in a room like that, which is not the same time that passes in other rooms. It moves differently. It makes different demands on the person in the chair. The man's breathing changed when it was going to change. The monitors showed what they showed. The tonal rendering had made a choice I respected, which was to go quiet. Not silent, but down to the ambient sounds of the room, the sounds that were present before and continued to be present, the sounds of systems doing what they do in rooms where people are dying. I was still there when the sequence ended. I was still sitting in the chair, Hands in my lap, when the screens went neutral and the room resolved back into the assessment hall. I sat there for a moment in the returned space. Then I advanced to Tier 6. One of the 3 remaining candidates had discontinued between Tier 4 and Tier 6. Pelthani cadet was no longer at their station. 2 of us remained, the Galthari student and me. She looked at me when I advanced to Tier 6. Direct eye contact in Galthari convention is not social acknowledgement in the way it is for humans. It doesn't mean hello or how are you holding up, I see you. In their social grammar, a direct look between peers in a shared experience is an acknowledgement of the shared reality. We are in this same space and that space is real. I held the look for a moment and then we both turned back to our screens. Tier 6 began with a dossier. The dossier was about the null resonance assessment itself. I read it with the particular attention I give anything with institutional history attached. Because institutional histories are how you understand what a system is actually trying to do rather than what it says it's trying to do. The assessment had been designed 47 years ago by a research team led by a Pelthani scholar, whose name translated into something my translator rendered as Continuance Architect Vel. The design philosophy was documented in enough detail to be useful. The assessment was not designed to identify people who cannot handle death-adjacent work. It was designed to identify the psychological architecture that death-adjacent work requires. The document used the Galthari term for it, which my translator rendered as sustained capacity under accumulation, the ability to do the next necessary thing regardless of what the last necessary thing cost. The distinction mattered to the designers because they had studied practitioners who burned out and practitioners who didn't, and the variable they had isolated was not resistance to being affected but something more specific, the ability to be affected and remain functional, which is a compound skill, not a single one. The dossier included outcome statistics, discontinuation rates per tier, averaged across the 41 cycles since the assessment's last major revision, notes from the research teams who had reviewed those statistics, and candidate testimonials from previous cycles, names anonymized, offered to illustrate the range of experience. Testimonial from the candidate who held the completion record, Tier 6, Section 3, 11 days of recovery care afterward, read as follows. I did not anticipate the weight being cumulative in the way it was. Each tier in isolation I believe I could have managed. The arrangement of them was different from the sum of them. By Tier 6, my reserves were known to me in a way they had not been known before. I was spending the last of something, and I was aware of spending it. And what I did not know was whether there was more after it, or whether what I spending was the last of what I had. That was accurate. It was also, I thought, a very good description of what the assessment was designed to produce. Not failure, but the discovery of your actual limits rather than your assumed ones. A practitioner who knows their actual limits is different from one who knows their assumed ones. The difference matters in rooms where getting the limit wrong has consequences. Tier 6 then opened its active component. A decision under uncertainty, a patient in terminal status. The data was present, the prognosis was unambiguous. But the intake documentation contained a phrasing that was genuinely ambiguous. A phrase in the patient's expressed wishes section that could be read as a directive toward continued intervention or as a directive toward comfort measures, depending on which words you weighted and which you understood as rhetorical emphasis and which you understood as specific instruction. The patient was now unable to communicate to clarify their intent. Family was present in the simulation. 2 figures whose body language carried the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who are waiting for someone to do something and do not know how to ask for it because they don't know what to ask for. The simulation asked me to make a decision and document it. I read the intake form 3 times. The ambiguous phrasing was in the 2nd paragraph. I read the surrounding sentences each time to understand what context the phrase was embedded in, because a phrase means something different depending on what it's adjacent to. And what it's adjacent to was a sentence that described what the patient did not want, and the ambiguous phrase was the characterization of what remained after removing what they didn't want. It was the language of someone working around the conversation rather than through it. Someone who was not ready. When they filled out the form, to say the direct thing, but who was indicating a direction. I documented my reasoning in detail, every inference, every weight I was assigning to every element and why. I chose comfort measures. I annotated the reasoning in enough detail that whoever reviewed it would be able to see the line from the documentation to the decision and to follow that line even if they disagreed with where it ended, because the point of documentation is not to justify yourself, but to make your thinking available for examination by people who weren't in the room when you were thinking it. The simulation accepted the documentation. Family figures in the scenario turned toward me. One of them, and this was a design choice that I considered genuinely sophisticated, reached out and placed their hand briefly on my arm. The haptic feedback in the desk surface was subtle, a slight increase in pressure, barely perceptible, ghost of contact. Whoever had designed that detail had understood something about what that gesture means and what it costs a practitioner to receive it, which is that it is not a reward and it is not an absolution, it is an acknowledgement. Of the same kind as the Gelthari look I'd shared with the student next to me. We are in this same space and it is real. Tier 6, Section 3 ended. The Gelthari student signalled discontinuation. I looked at her as she stood. She held her head crest at a specific angle I hadn't seen before. I found out what it meant later. In a conversation with one of the Institute's cultural orientation staff, told me that the posture is used when parting from someone you've been travelling alongside. It meant something in the range of the path you're on is well kept, or I see where you're going and the road is good. She held it for a moment and then walked to the exit. I watched her go. Then I was alone in the assessment hall with the proctor and 13 empty stations and one lit screen. I advanced to Tier 7. Tier loaded slowly. All previous tiers had been instantaneous. The screen transition was seamless. One state to the next without perceptible gap. Tier 7 took 3 seconds. I used them to adjust my chair, which had been sitting slightly wrong for my back for the last hour and a half. A small misalignment in the seat height that I'd been compensating for without addressing because there hadn't been a natural pause. There was one now. When the screens came up, Tier 7 was different from everything before it. It was not a patient scenario, not a decision matrix. It was not an immersive environment or a case dossier or a simulation of any kind. It was a question. A single line of text centered on the screen in the clean standard notation of the Institute's interface. My translator rendered it as, "Describe, in your own terms, what you understand the work to be." I read it twice. Then I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The exam hall ceiling was white and slightly curved at the edges, where the wall met it in a smooth arc rather than a right angle. The lighting was embedded in that curve, a continuous strip that distributed its output evenly across the room. It was a good light, clinical without being harsh. It had lit 12 other people through the same sequence I'd just completed, and all 12 of them had stopped before this point, and the room had held all of their stopping and remained clean and odorless and ready for the next one. I thought about the question, not about how to answer it well, about how to answer it honestly, which is a different problem. Answering a question well means finding the formulation that is most persuasive and most complete in the fewest words. Answering it honestly means not knowing in advance what the answer is, which means you have to write toward it instead of writing from it. And the difference in those two processes is that writing towards something requires you to find out what you actually think rather than articulating you've already decided. I had spent 17 years in proximity to the thing this question was asking about. I had professional language for it. The language of nursing practice and palliative care literature and clinical supervision. I had the language of the Corvith dossier I'd just read. The language of sustained capacity under accumulation, which was a precise formulation, even if it was not a warm one. I had things I'd said to families, things I'd said to colleagues, things I'd said to medical students doing their rotation through our ward, and asking me at the nursing station after a difficult room why I did this work. And the things I'd said to them were all true, but none of them were complete. Because the complete answer is not a thing you can say to someone on their third week of clinical rotation without them hearing only the simplified version of it. I started writing. I wrote for a long time. The word counter at the bottom of the screen climbed without me watching it. I wrote about what the work was, not the job description, not the institutional framework, not the answer I'd give in an interview. The actual answer. The one that is still being assembled after 17 years because the last patient you haven't yet met is the one who might teach you the element you're still missing. I wrote about the difference between fighting death and attending death, not as a philosophical position but as a practical distinction. The difference in what it requires of the practitioner in the room, what decisions it leads to, what it means for the patient in the bed. I had spent 17 years in a system that was built as the Corvath system was built, around the instinct to fight, and I had learned within that system the secondary lesson that fighting is not all the room needs, and knowing the difference is not a betrayal of the primary commitment. It is the maturation of it. I wrote about the intake form from Tier 6, not the specific scenario about what that kind of document means. A person fills out an intake form at a moment when they are not ready to be specific, which is the usual moment when the form is presented to them. They indicate a direction without being able to commit to it fully, because committing to it fully would require them to accept the thing they are still working toward accepting. The document is a communication between the person they are at the time of writing and the practitioners who will need to act at the time of acting. The practitioner's job is to receive that communication accurately, to weight it for what it is rather than what it would be if the person had been ready. Getting that right is technical skill. Getting that right consistently across years of practice, in rooms where you are tired and the family is watching and the monitors are saying what they're saying, is something that the technical skill is in service of but is not identical to. I wrote about presence, about what requesting presence meant in the Corvath framework, and what it means in practice in a room, and whether those two things are the same or that the framework is a map of the territory rather than the territory itself. A map is useful. You need it. The thing the patient in the bed is asking for when they request presence is not a framework. It is a person who can stay in the room without requiring the room to be other than it is. I wrote about what the room asks of you, not abstractly, specifically. What it asks when you first learn to do it and what it asks after 17 years, what has changed and what has not changed, and which parts of what has not changed are constants of the work and which parts are constants of me, and whether I can tell the difference with any reliability. I wrote about the Geltari cadet who had just walked out. Not by name, not in clinical terms, but about what I'd observed in her over the course of the tiers and what it had said about what good preparation for this work looks like and what it cannot give you yet. She was going to be a practitioner of real ability. The preparation had done something real in her. What she had stopped at was a specific intersection between preparation and experience, and the thing on the other side of it could not be given to her in advance. She would have to build it in rooms, the way I had, the way everyone who has it has built it. I wrote about the weight being cumulative and what you do with that, not how to avoid it. You do with it when it arrives. I wrote about my answer to the Velthris admissions coordinator's implicit question, the one that had never been asked directly. What was I doing in this hall, at this desk, after no formal preparation, sitting through a 7-tier assessment that had stopped everyone before me? And the honest answer was not that I had prepared differently, but that I had been doing the actual thing for long enough, that the assessment and the actual thing had significant overlap. The assessment was built to simulate an accumulation. I had the accumulation. The simulation was accurate enough and well made enough that it registered as real to me in all the ways it needed to. I came to it carrying what I came to it carrying. I stopped writing when I had written everything I could see clearly and started running into the edge of what I could currently see. There is more answer to the question than I could produce that day in that room. There is probably more answer to it than I will ever have, because the answer is assembled from the rooms you've been in, and the last room hasn't happened yet. I submitted the response. The screen held for a moment. The cursor blinked. Then it displayed a second line of text. Tier 7 is complete. And below it, assessment concluded. I sat with that for a moment. Just the words. Then I noticed that the proctor was standing at my shoulder, not behind me, beside me. It was a specific choice of position, and I registered it as one. He was looking at my screen. His secondary head crest was doing something I hadn't observed it do before. A slow, sustained oscillation at half height, even and measured, that didn't match any of the behavioral references I'd been building since arriving at the Institute. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been a practitioner?" 17 years, I said. He was quiet again. The oscillation continued. The assessment, he said, was designed by a researcher who had been a continuance practitioner for 9 years before she entered academic work. She has said publicly that the tier structure reflects the accumulation she experienced in practice. Each tier corresponds to a specific type of weight she identified in her own career. She designed the assessment expecting that the candidates best suited to the work would feel each tier and continue regardless. He paused. Did not design a trivial tier. She intended genuine difficulty. None of it was trivial, I said. He looked at me, both eyes direct, full attention posture. You did not discontinue. No, I am asking, he said, the particular care of someone choosing their words for precision rather than politeness. What allowed you to continue? Because the discontinuation records are not fails of will. The Gelthari cadet who left before you is the strongest candidate in this cohort. Every metric the program tracks. She will be a practitioner of significant distinction. She stopped at Tier 6, Section 4. I know, I said. What allowed you to continue where she did not? I thought about how to answer that accurately. Familiarity, I said finally. Not with the specific scenarios. I hadn't seen those scenarios before. But with the structure of the accumulation. The weight you're describing, the cumulative weight, I carry it, not in simulation time. In real time, in real rooms, continuously for 17 years. The tiers are an accurate rendering of what that accumulation is like, and that accuracy is what made the assessment difficult. Nothing in the tiers surprised me. Some of it was hard. Tier 5 was hard. Tier 7 cost me something. But none of it was unfamiliar territory. He was still looking at me. The Tier 7 question, I said, was the one that required the most. Because it asked me to articulate what I know, and I'm still in the process of knowing it. That's an ongoing project, not a completed one. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I had the sense he was filing things, that the conversation was being treated with the same careful attention he'd given the assessment data. The curriculum, he said at last, does not include a preparation for the Tier 7 question in its current form. Curriculum teaches clinical framework, decision-making protocols, presence methodology, case analysis. It does not, he stopped. Restarted. Does not address what you described in your response. It can't, I said. Not from the starting point. You can gesture toward it. You can design conditions that allow it to develop. But the content of what I wrote in Tier 7 isn't something that can be installed. It's assembled from rooms, from the specific rooms, the specific decisions, the specific costs paid over time. Curriculum prepares people to enter those rooms. The rooms teach the rest. The oscillation in his crest had stopped. It was held at a sustained angle, and his posture had the quality of a person who is recording something internally that they don't want to lose. He said, "Your file was classified as an administrative error." Yes. You should not have been admitted to this program under normal intake procedures. No, I agreed. I am going to recommend that the error be I looked at him. The Curriculum Review Committee has been examining the Tier 7 protocol for 3 cycles, he said. The open question format replaced an earlier simulation sequence that had a 98% discontinuation rate before its conclusion, effective at measuring the outer limit, but not at providing actionable information about what lies beyond it, because no one reached beyond it. The open question was designed to solve that problem, to create a tier that could be answered rather than only survived. He paused. No previous candidate has answered it in a way that gave the review committee anything to work with. They received responses, but the responses described preparation, what the candidate had learned, what the curriculum had built in them. They described the map. Your response described the territory. I sat with that. I wasn't trying to answer a design question, I said. I was trying to answer the question. Yes, he said, that's what they've been waiting for. He looked at my screen one more time. I looked at it too. Beside the assessment concluded line in smaller notation that I had registered without reading when I first saw the completion message, 4 words. No threshold breach recorded. I'd spent 17 years receiving professional evaluations, annual reviews, competency assessments, clinical audits. The commendation from the hospital board that had been framed and put on a wall in the staff room and immediately covered by a shift rota where it remained for 2 years until someone moved it to make room for a notice about the refrigerator policy. I had read all of those evaluations. Some had been useful, a few had been accurate. No threshold breach recorded was 4 words, and it was the most precise summary of my professional life I had ever seen written anywhere. I stood up. The chair scraped on the polished floor. The sound was very loud in the empty room. I looked around the hall. 12 empty stations, each one still displaying the last active screen from the point of discontinuation, frozen at the moment each candidate had put down what they'd been carrying. Tier 2 at 1 station, Tier 3 at 3 others, each showing a slightly different scene, Tier 4 at 2, and Tier 5 at 1, and 4 at Tier 6, the last one at Section 4. A record of where 13 people had reached the edge of their preparation. Not failures. I need to be careful about that framing, even in my own thinking. The assessment was not designed to identify people who break. It was designed to identify the specific architecture that doesn't break and to understand what produces it. The 12 people who had left that room before the final tier had done real work to reach the tier where they stopped. They had been built for something serious, and they had demonstrated it. The fact that they had not gone further was not a negative finding. It was information about where their preparation had reached and where additional experience would take them. The difference between me and the Galtari student who had held through the most of any of them was not that I felt less. Her control through the accumulated tiers was a demonstration of genuine psychological skill, built deliberately over 2 years through a curriculum that was well designed for exactly that purpose. The difference was that she was 2 years into a preparation for the work, and I 17 years into the work. The preparation pointed toward where I was. The work had carried me there. Both paths lead to the same place. They just take different amounts of time. I gathered my tablet and my identification case. Old habit from hospital admissions. Don't carry more than you can carry while keeping your hands free. The proctor walked with me to the door. At the door he said, "The next cohort assessment cycle begins in 43 days. 14 candidates enrolled." I waited. "I would like to recommend," he said, "that you attend their preparatory seminar, not as a candidate, as a practitioner resource." I thought about what I'd written in Tier 7, about what can be taught and what can't, and how you point toward the thing that can't be taught so that it develops when the rooms start providing material for it to develop from. I could talk to them about the gap, I said. Curriculum prepares them for, and what it doesn't give them yet, and why the second category isn't a curriculum failure. That might be useful. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I had in mind." I stepped through the door. Corridor outside was bright and clean and smelled of nothing, the way the whole institute did. I stood in it for a moment. Somewhere above me, through 2 floors of polished material and academic architecture, 14 new candidates were building their frameworks, attending lectures, running simulations, learning the language of the work before they had been in enough rooms for the language to attach to something real. Would sit the assessment in 43 days. Some would reach Tier 6. 1 or 2, perhaps, would reach Tier 6, Section 4. They would be better prepared than the cohort I had just sat alongside because the Curriculum Review Committee now had something to work with, and whoever sat down to evaluate what I had written in Tier 7 would identify the parts that could be translated into something teachable. Some of it could. I had noted which parts while I was writing. Some of it couldn't, and I had noted that too, because knowing what cannot be taught directly is the first step toward designing the conditions that let it develop indirectly. The Shave the Gap is different from being helpless about it. You can orient a curriculum toward the gap's edges even if you can't cross the gap from the curriculum side. Can teach people to recognize what they're missing before they have what it takes to fill it. That recognition is not nothing. That recognition is, in fact, a significant part of what keeps practitioners from pretending the gap doesn't exist and making decisions as if they further along than they are. I started walking toward the elevator at the end of the corridor. Somewhere behind me in the assessment hall, Proctor was returning my file to the review archive, in whatever column the archive used to track psychological stress response, whatever number supposed to correspond to 11 days of restorative care. There would be a number that had not changed from the number it was when I walked in. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed. The car moved upward through the clean, odorless air of the institute. Outside on the ground floor, there would be the common spaces, the other students, ordinary traffic of an institution that was doing serious work and knew it. I looked at my hands in the elevator light. 17 years of rooms. 17 years of staying. The number on the column beside my file hadn't moved. That was as accurate as it gets.